Good afternoon, everybody. My Nuffield journey began with a telephone call from Matt Swain, a 2002 Nuffield scholar. Matt contacted me after he listened to a podcast that I sheepishly agreed to do following the completion of a Just Farmers workshop, led by another Nuffield scholar, Anna Jones. Matt outlined the various benefits of doing a Nuffield to me, which were hard to argue with. The opportunity to travel and to meet people from farming communities across the world. But the thing that sealed the deal for me was when Matt gave me the Nuffield health warning. Traveling solo, he said, has a habit of making you look at life through a different lens and reevaluate what's important to you. What Matt didn't know at the time was that my life was at a bit of a crossroads, both personally and professionally. And the opportunity to hold a mirror up to both was both exciting and daunting in equal measure. So at the time of that phone call, as Jim mentioned, I was working in the environmental sector for the wildlife trusts. And I was doing that alongside working on our family dairy farm near Melton Mowbray in Leicestershire. At home on the farm, we milk 200 pedigree Holsteins and supply milk to Long Clawson Dairy, a cooperative of 33 dairy farmers in Leicestershire and Nottinghamshire, and makers of the world-famous Stilton cheese. I had hoped to carve a role out for myself within the wildlife trusts, where I could bridge the divide between the two communities. Both wanted to achieve net zero targets, to embrace nature-friendly farming, and to create more space for wildlife in the farmed landscape. And yet, when I looked in my area for examples of successful partnerships, I struggled to find them. What I found more of was the exact opposite in light of the ongoing challenge of bovine TB where I live. So it's with thanks to the Nuffield Farming Scholarships Trust, to my main sponsor, the Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board, and Long Clawson Dairy, that I have been able to travel to Denmark, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Wisconsin in the USA to find examples of great partnerships with a view to bringing those key lessons back to the UK. So, what did I find? Well, I found that the relationship between dairy farmers and environmental organisations is deeply rooted in cultural heritage, economic heritage, and political landscapes. Starting with cultural heritage, this key influence was first highlighted to me during my very first meeting with Paul Petterson of Arla in Denmark. Within around 10 minutes of our meeting, Paul put his theory to me. To his mind, Scandinavian culture has been founded by the Vikings. It's a culture that's based on trust and equality. And I felt that as I travelled across Denmark and Sweden. In contrast, Paul felt that the UK's culture has been founded by the likes of Downton Abbey. The haves and the have-nots. Now, at first I thought this theory was a slightly left field, but on reflection, I wondered if Paul had highlighted something that's often the elephant in the room. Could it be that those working in the environmental sector look at dairy farmers and see us as the landed gentry, a community of people who inherit land regardless of merit, while they have to fundraise furiously to buy scraps of wildlife-rich land as and when they come on the market? Moving on to economic heritage, this key influence was highlighted to me initially during my travels to the Netherlands. As I travelled through the country, I heard stories of how the country had become the agricultural superpower that we all know today. Many of these stories could trace their roots back to the end of the Second World War. In 1945, the Dutch population were on the brink of mass starvation. In response to that, the Dutch government encouraged and supported the intensification of agricultural practices to increase domestic food supply, often with devastating impacts on the natural environment. You can draw parallels with what happened here in the UK at the same time. Since 1945, we have lost a devastating 97% of our wildflower meadows. But often when this story is told by the environmental sector, it can feel like the finger of shame is pointed directly and solely at the farming community. I've always felt that that story has had a missing link, and it was during a meeting with the World Wildlife Fund in the Netherlands where I found that. That being that farmers have got to operate within a system, but sometimes that system traps them. It made me wonder how many farmers in the UK in the 1950s and 60s took a plough to their wildflower meadows with a gut-wrenching feeling in their stomachs. Lastly, political landscapes. This is either carrot or stick. Do statutory policies penalise dairy farmers for doing wrong by the environment, as I felt they did in Denmark and the Netherlands? Or do they reward farmers for doing right by the environment, as I felt they did in Sweden and Wisconsin? It's not so much the policies themselves that have the direct impact on how the two communities work together. It's the way they frame the dairy industry to other communities, including the general public. Those that penalise paint dairy farmers as only ever being part of the climate change problem, whereas those that reward paint the community as being part of the climate change solution. They take the heat out of the situation. They empower farmers, and they create space for partnerships to flourish. My Nuffield journey has left me with an enormous amount of hope. I saw examples of fantastic partnerships in all 4 countries I visited, sometimes even when some of those key influencers were working against them. The photograph behind me is one that I think typifies what the ideal partnership looks like. Here we have Ricardo in the blue t-shirt. Ricardo works for the Nature Conservancy, one of the USA's largest environmental organizations. And stood next to Ricardo are Chris and Brenda Connolly, a husband and wife team of high-gem Holsteins. Ricardo is an inspiring leader who believes in the art of the possible. He entered the partnership with Chris and Brenda without any prejudgment, and he didn't shame them for the choices they made on their business. Instead, he approached the partnership with kindness and curiosity as to what motivated Chris and Brenda, and through that, he was able to find their common ground. He empowered Chris and Brenda to make the right decisions for their business, and he ensured that funding was available through the supply chain. In return, Chris and Brenda approached the partnership with open minds and put their trust and faith in Ricardo. So, what have I done since my Nuffield journey finished? Well, I've tried to embrace living to my North Star, as advised to us by Sarah Bell during our pre-CSC in London. And shortly after my travels to Denmark and Sweden, I decided to leave the comfort of the environmental sector. A long overdue move into the dairy industry now sees me working for Long Clawson Dairy, a milk buyer, where I lead on our on-farm sustainability work. I now have the enormous privilege of working alongside 33 fellow dairy farmers, agricultural managers from major UK supermarkets, and other key stakeholders in the dairy supply chain. I now feel like I can make a real difference on the ground. Much of the work we do at Clawson with regards to sustainability is centred around lowering our carbon emissions. And that's right and proper. They're a really important part of our sustainability journey. But it was meeting Gustav Kamp, a Swedish dairy farmer supplying Arla and also on their board, as well as Jordan Matthews of Rosie Lane Holsteins, that made me realise it's much more than just carbon emissions. It's also about protecting and enhancing the biodiversity on our dairy farms. It's about looking after our watercourses. And it's about positively connecting to our local communities. They're all just as important. So as such, over the last year, I've co-designed personalised sustainability action plans with each and every one of our farmers. And all of these elements form a key part of those. Now, I think before my Nuffield journey, I would have been tempted to base those plans solely on the data that's come out of 3 years' worth of carbon auditing with our partner, Map of Ag. But it was meeting the likes of Jolanda Janssen, a communications expert in the Netherlands, and Anne Berg Olsen, a farm liaison manager of Tisa Dairy in Denmark, that made me realise how important it is that farmers come on this journey with us. They've got to feel empowered, and they cannot feel judged for where their beginning point is on their sustainability journey. Also, every story that sits behind each and every data set in those carbon audits is crucial. And as such, that also now forms part of those personalised plans. Lastly, meeting the wonderful, inspiring Sarah George of Wisconsin Women in Conservation has made me determined to diversify the voices we hear at Long Clawson Dairy. I want to hear from those women in our cooperative who describe themselves to me as just the farmer's wife, when I know they are a driving force and keeping the show on the road behind the scenes. I also want to hear more from the younger women and men who do their lion's share of the practical work on our dairy farms, even though they're often not represented at our formal farmer meetings. And finally, my Nuffield journey has made me appreciate the true power of partnerships. We cannot do this alone. We can't achieve sustainable food security and combat climate change as a dairy industry. We've got to do it together. So on that note, earlier this year, I invited representatives from several local environmental organisations to Long Clawson Dairy as a meet and greet, just to get to know one another. It's early days, but hopefully these partnerships will evolve into long-term symbiotic relationships. But so far, we've planted over 100 10-foot trees across a third of our farms with Leicestershire County Council, and we've planted hundreds of new metres of hedgerow with the Woodland Trust. But it goes beyond that. There are so many stakeholders in our sustainability journey. So, over that same time period, developing relationships with our vet practices, with our farmers' feed nutritionists, and with their farm consultants has been just as important. We've all got to be singing from the same hymn sheet. I hope my Nuffield journey has given me the tools to become an effective leader within the dairy industry and to positively contribute to a community that I feel immensely proud to be part of. Thank you.